I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. Part of my job at CSIS is to stop erroneous things from happening or mistaken things from happening. And I regret very much that the Trump administration put forward a budget that planned to zero out OPIC. I've been around this business for a long time. I worked at Citibank in Argentina. I worked in investment banking here in the United States. I worked at AID. I've worked at IFC in the bank group, and I've been here at CSIS for 7 years. And if I look out at the world and the way the world is going, we need more development finance, not less development finance. I did an article in Forbes.com a couple weeks ago called "We Don't Need to Be Zeroing Out OPIC, we need to be putting it on steroids." So you can see how I really feel about it in reading my article. But this conversation is part of that. I'm confident, though, that as various parts of the Trump administration understand the potential of OPIC and the challenges that we face outside, as well as the job creation opportunities, American job creation opportunities of OPIC, as well as the national security component of OPIC, that they'll see the value of this. So I'm confident that this is an opportunity for persuasion, and that we ought to use this opportunity for questioning it, for maybe thinking about a broader, more bold use of development finance. We've done a lot of work on this here at CSIS in the last 5 or 6 years. Many of you have helped us do this. We did a report on American development finance capacities 5 years ago, and then with the help of Elizabeth Littlefield last year, along with the European Development Finance Association of the member, the alphabet soup of European development finance institutions, we did a report about 6 months ago about DFI's coming of age. Regardless of the somewhat dysfunctional conversation here in Washington, over the next 5 years, the amount of foreign aid known as ODA and the amount of DFI investment activity, at some point those lines are going to cross. There's going to be more DFI activity, regardless of whatever's happening in Washington, than there is foreign aid 5 years from now. So this is not going away, whether we're having this, so I think the opportunity for us is to be a part of that wave and to build on it, and for the United States to have jobs and to have American jobs and to be more secure. That's what we should be thinking about, as opposed to having I think we need to kind of reframe the conversation, and this is our contribution to helping reframe the conversation. I don't think I need to introduce my friends on this panel. These are the former heads of OPIC in the last 15 years. They're all had very distinguished careers. I think you have their bios in front of you. I'm going to start with my really good friend, Elizabeth Littlefield. I have 2 questions for her to start, which are, does America need a development finance institution? And then I want you to tell me, does OPIC benefit the American taxpayer?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for your leadership on this issue over the last 5 or 6 years. It's been really great to see the role of development finance and private capital elevating across the world, and a lot of that's been the voices here in Washington. So I guess the short answer to that for me would be yes. The United States urgently needs a development finance institution, and it needs it to do far more than it's doing right now, and it needs it to be brought into the 21st century. Promoting American business abroad is the way to project American leadership, innovation, and strength across the globe. I'd say 4 reasons for that. First of all, harnessing private capital to not taxpayer money to address global needs like infrastructure, health, education is budget smart. We have a proven successful model in OPIC. We know how to do it. OPIC's been generating income for the taxpayer for 36 straight years. And it's basically development that pays for itself. That's the first point. The second point is helping U.S. companies, especially small businesses, invest abroad in those fast-growing markets is an opportunity for them to grow at home and create jobs both at home and abroad. About 3/4 of OPIC's business now is with small businesses. And what's interesting about that is all the other countries, whether it's China or the Europeans, are doing this development finance business far more aggressively than we are. Last year, the UK government proposed to quadruple the budget of its DFI, its OPIC equivalent, if you will. The Chinese are adding the equivalent of OPIC's entire staff to their equivalent every single year. So we're being left in the dust at this rate, and will soon be a speck in the rearview mirror of some of our competitors. So we need a level playing field for our large businesses and small businesses investing in these markets. I'd say the third reason is, extremism and pandemics know no boundaries. And our
By extremism, you mean terrorists, right? Just saying, for our friends in the Trump administration, terrorists.
Yes.
Right?
Okay. So, yes, extremism, pandemics, these are a global phenomenon and they know no boundaries. And our national security depends on creating stable, resilient societies in these markets that provide hope, opportunity, and frankly, jobs to their local citizens to quell some of these forces. I'm very proud to say that OPIC's work in post-conflict countries, or conflict-affected countries, is now a third of the total portfolio, is in countries like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ukraine, places that are affected by conflict. Actually, it reminds me again what Robert Gates used to say, which is, he said, I'd much rather have investments than have to have troops in most of these places, and I think that resonates today. The fourth reason is that, frankly, investment and business partnership is really what other countries want most from the U.S. In many cases, more than aid, and certainly more than our advice. I remember Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, saying, I'd rather have $1 of investment for every $10 of aid that I get. So, and you think about it, in a world where the U.S. is often misunderstood, what more powerful way to project the best of American values and innovation than for the U.S. government to be financing a U.S. company investing in partnership with a Ukrainian or Egyptian or whatever company in the very things the people of that country want most from their own government: clean water, sanitation, infrastructure, roads, bridges, education. That's what we're projecting when we invest with a DFI alongside U.S. businesses in these markets. So yes, we have an effective, efficient, accountable, transparent agency that makes money every single year for the taxpayer, and it's projecting the best of American values throughout the world. So I would say the short answer to that is yes. And I'd go even further to say, I think actually this is a real opportunity now to elevate the conversation, to really show all the facts and say, look, here are the facts. Don't we all think that this administration and the rest of us want to actually rethink the way the global development architecture of this country is designed? It hasn't really been touched in 50 years, and there's a whole lot more that could be done if we update, modernize the U.S.'s approach to development finance. So I actually welcome the opportunity, not the disruption of the conversation and the morale and the heat loss that goes on at an agency like OPIC when threats are around it, but I think it's an opportunity to have a real conversation about what we should be doing in our development agenda.
I've got several other leading questions for you, Elizabeth, but I want to first recognize my really good friend, Congressman Charles Bustani, who's here, who's a hero for our time. I miss you, Congressman Bustani. I wish you were on the Hill. I know you've been a great supporter on free trade. You're a great supporter of official development assistance. You're a great supporter of OPIC. Thanks for your presence here, and thanks for your public service. Really glad you're here. Thanks for being here. Okay, Elizabeth, so let me ask a couple more leading questions. Okay, so is OPIC corporate welfare?
Certainly not. It doesn't provide grants. It charges the full cost of its services in the form of fees and interest, and it makes money every year for the taxpayer.
Okay, so if I was a member of Congress and you were up on the Hill and they said, well, why can't Citibank or HSBC do this? Why do we need OPIC?
Well, they're not doing it right now. If you're a young businessman, maybe a returned soldier going to Afghanistan, and you want to set up a cashew processing or a juice processing factory in Kandahar, which is going to employ hundreds and hundreds of people in that very difficult part of the world, you think Citibank's going to lend them money? No.
I'm going to guess, having worked at Citibank, the answer is no. Yeah, they will not be doing that.
The other interesting thing is, obviously the most conflict-affected countries that are the biggest challenge to our national security tend to be the lowest income countries. And guess what percentage of U.S. foreign direct investment is in the low-income countries of the world?
I'm going to guess it's not very high.
0.07%.
That's really low.
So you think banks are going to be lending in those markets where there aren't even any U.S. investors? Thank you.
No, thank you. All right, I got a couple more of these. Then I'm going to move on to my other friends in the panel. But, okay, so I think it's important. Could you talk about American jobs? Because it seems to me that one of the things that When I think about I think the Trump administration is absolutely right to be asking a series of very hard questions about how should we need a rethink. We need reform. We need a rethink of how we use our various instruments of our power. And so I think it's very legitimate for the Trump administration to be asking a series of hard questions. And I think they're also asking some questions like, what do the various things that we do mean for Americans in the United States? So could you, Elizabeth, talk about what OPIC's activities and what they had to do with American jobs in the United States?
So Dan, we know that when companies invest abroad, they grow their markets and they grow their global footprint, and they're able to create jobs not only in the places that they're investing, but back at home to service those jobs. So there's clear evidence over and over again that when companies invest abroad, they create jobs back at home. And just last year, the projects that OPIC financed last year created a total of 400 jobs here in the U.S., each one of which is, of course, supporting many more people than that. So while creating U.S. jobs is not the singular purpose of OPIC, it is a clear secondary benefit to all the investments that OPIC does.
Okay, so I want to talk about a couple other things. I am going to move on, but I want to talk about Ebola. I think that one of the things that if you are skeptical about American engagement in the world, I think the vote for the $3 billion supplemental in the House of Representatives was I think 435-0 to spend. So everyone agreed, let's spend as much money as possible to keep Ebola out of the United States. I think it was 100-0. So I'm guessing Mick Mulvaney voted for the Ebola package of $3 billion. I'm guessing Rand Paul voted for the Ebola package. I think it meant that everybody that was a member of the Freedom Caucus voted for the Ebola package, meaning that they did not, if I have a conversation with someone on the Hill who may be very skeptical of foreign aid or international engagement in the world, and I start with, we really need to worry about health system strengthening in Sierra Leone, I think they'll throw me out of the office. But if I say, do you want an Ebola case showing up at the Houston airport, they're going to say, oh no, I do not want that. So I want you to talk about what role did OPIC play, because it's a little bit counterintuitive. What role has OPIC played in places because we're going to have other funny named pandemics. Like clockwork, we're going to have funny named pandemics from now on. There's more urbanization. There is more than 50% of the world lives in cities. The amount of air travel that's going on and the amount of animal husbandry that's going on in the world means that the diseases from animals to people are much more highly likely to happen. So that means we're going to have funny named pandemics every couple of years. So sometime, I don't wish it, but sometime in the next 3 to 4 years, there will be some other funny named pandemic. Everyone knows all these funny names: H1N1, avian flu, Ebola, Zika, and it goes on and on and on. And there's going to be more of them. So Elizabeth, would you please tell me, in the pandemic, there are specific roles for a DFI to play in a place like Liberia when there's Ebola. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I'd answer that by saying two things. First of all, just as an example, OPIC is providing a huge amount of finance for hospitals throughout the world, throughout the poor countries of the world, especially in Africa. For example, we funded...
I thought all hospitals were run by governments. Are you telling me that some are run by the private sector?
So believe it or not, in Angola, another one of those low-income countries, we financed a local diagnostic center in Luanda for $8 million. That's profitable. And that's just one example. In total, the health clinics and hospitals that OPIC has funded in the emerging markets profitably, with American partners, in each case, total is providing about 7 million patient visits have been provided through the financing provided by OPIC over the last few years. So that's thing one. More and more medical services are being transferred to the private sector, and there are American companies here, Aspen and others, that are actually finding very profitable ways to provide those medical services that people so desperately want. Again, what a great way for us to be projecting American leadership and goodwill than to have an American company providing those medical services that in many cases the governments themselves aren't able to provide. Secondly, with respect to Ebola, I was very proud to actually be part of the U.S. response to Ebola. I led an investor trip, believe it or not, to the Ebola-affected countries, Liberia and Sierra Leone especially, with 10 U.S. investors, real live U.S. investors.
You guys must have all been out of your minds.
Well, it was safe to travel, and that was part of the reason that we wanted to announce this large trip, was to show that, look, here are real live American investors.
We're going to be okay, and it's going to be okay, and we can do this.
And out of those trips, about 4 or 5 investments have happened, including this is coming full circle. We've introduced the iconic big hospital in Monrovia to 4 or 5 U.S. investors that are taking a deep interest in investing in it, refurbishing it so it can be a center for medical tourism, they call it, so that people from throughout West Africa can go there and get their services. So that was a direct outcome of an investor trip right after the crisis was over, where these investors went to see how they could help rebuild those economies and get them back on track again.
Okay, so I have one last question for you, which is about China. So again, I think the world is not stopping because of our dysfunction. The world is not stopping because of sort of inside the Beltway belly button contemplation exercises that we periodically do, and which I think we're doing right now. So could you please talk a little bit about, in your time at OPIC, would you talk a little bit about how you're coming across China? Because the rest of the developing world isn't waiting around for us to kind of figure out what we're going to be when we grow up. They got other options. They can take their business down the street to the Chinese. So could you just talk a little bit about how you came across increasingly China in your time at OPIC, please?
So I'm sure Rob and Peter had a similar experience, but I hear with greater and greater intensity and refrain everywhere I go, every country, why are you guys being left behind? Like, the America's nowhere and China's everywhere. And I patiently have to describe that it's not the lack of adventurism of our U.S. companies, but we have a different economic model. We don't, direct investment. It has to come in a bottom-up kind of way. But clearly, China is everywhere. Their trade with Africa right now is double what the U.S.'s trade with Africa is.
I think they're the largest trading partner to Africa today,
Yes.
Not the United States, not Europe, it's China.
Yeah, and it's actually double what our entire investment in that continent is. My advice to countries across the world is, you can choose whoever you want to do business with, but make sure that you're choosing the right thing for your country, for your people, because more often than not, in the end of the day, that Chinese-built stadium or airport is going to be more expensive than an American one.
Because of the repairs and having to fix it, because they do it cheaply?
Well, building it twice can cost more than building it once as well, I would say.
Do they want American business?
Absolutely. It's considered very prestigious, and they want more involvement. As I said earlier, what I find in country after country, and again, I'm sure Peter and Rob found this too, they really don't want to talk about aid. When they come here, they want to see partnerships of equals, investing in things that are good for their people, that help transfer the innovation and technology that the U.S. has to offer. The AIIB, which was created...
Sorry, what's the AIIB?
Excuse me, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
This is a Chinese-led competitor of the World Bank and a Chinese-led competitor of the Asian Development Bank, correct?
That's correct. Thank you for that, Dan. That is a clear indication that China intends to aggressively muscle into these markets. Another clear indication, as I mentioned earlier, is the fact that all the European equivalents of OPIC, the European DFIs, are growing extremely quickly. They're much larger than OPIC is by a long shot when you compare it to the size of the economy. And as I mentioned earlier, in the UK, they're quadrupling the size of their DFI because they see this as such a strategic way for their country to engage in the world.
Okay, so what you're saying is while we have dysfunctional conversations in Washington, people aren't waiting outside in the hallway waiting for 2 or 3 years while we kind of work out our issues. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
That would be a way of putting it, yes, Dan.
Okay, thank you. Good. Okay, so Rob, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it, and thanks for all the collaboration we've had with you over the last several years here at CSIS. I've got a series of questions for you. I want to first start with, is OPIC corporate welfare?
Yeah, that's, first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here with my colleagues. OPIC has enjoyed a surprising degree of bipartisan support. And as we talk about building OPIC, updating OPIC into the development finance entity it needs to be done on a bipartisan basis, and I think it can be. So I'm delighted to be here with Elizabeth and Peter. The corporate welfare tag sort of started back in the 90s when there was the contract on America, or a contract for America, depending on how you looked at it, and it included zeroing out OPIC. And my reaction to it then was to come up and lobby because I'm in the oil and gas business, and we had gotten a concession in 1993 in Venezuela. This was before Chavez was a force to be reckoned with, and we fortunately beat the Christmas rush and got out of Venezuela. But we bought political risk insurance. Nobody else would sell it to us. No commercial provider would sell it to us, and we knew we couldn't get bank financing. So it was the option that existed in addition to what the private sector was willing to do. And so I don't think we compete head-to-head with the private sector. And in terms of corporate welfare, I think what led people to make that argument was we have had some large blue-chip corporates from the United States who bought political risk insurance primarily. Occasionally they want to do financing. They probably could do that on their balance sheet. But the figure that she cited is so important. 75% of the business that OPIC does is with small and medium-sized businesses. There are very, very few great big deals with blue-chip corporates that can't, that if we suggested you need to finance this on your balance sheet, that would be the final answer. So the answer is no, I don't believe it's corporate welfare.
So just to clarify, because I don't think we've had this conversation yet, part of the conversation, which is that OPIC provides political risk insurance, and provides project finance, and provides other forms of financing as well for projects in the developing world. Is that fair to say?
And there's one other piece. We help seed private equity funds.
You help seed private equity funds. It's actually quite important in places where you've never had a private equity fund before, say in certain African regions, for example, where you may not get. And I'd say my guess is most emerging market private equity funds have gotten financing from institutions like OPIC or other DFIs. That's been a major part of actually standing up that kind of capital that has been very important for us to work ourselves out of a job in terms of not providing foreign assistance, right? It's a way of transitioning out of a foreign assistance paradigm. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd say it's safe to say OPIC is a market maker in many geographies, sectors, and creative approaches.
Okay, Rob, I would like you to tell, you made many trips to some very difficult places when you're in the Bush administration to try and bring American investors and American capital, thinking of places like Afghanistan in particular, but I know you were in other difficult and challenging places as well. I know Elizabeth and Peter have also had that experience. But would you tell a couple of stories, in particular in countries that have been impacted by terrorism or somehow kind of on the radar screen because of terrorism, where there's a national security optic, if you will, to OPIC being involved in a particular country?
Well, this really started with my desire, and it wasn't particularly new, but it was one that was a higher priority for me, perhaps than some, for OPIC not to be a second or third responder, but to be a first responder, to try and drive investment into places where basically nothing was going to happen without the benefit of OPIC mitigating the risk of an investor. And so yes, Afghanistan and Pakistan were two priorities. And just one quick story, I went with a group up into the mountains between Afghanistan and Pakistan on the Pakistani border, an area called the federally administered tribal areas. We were trying to figure out how could we help address what the tribal leaders, had identified as their chief challenge economically, which was electricity, inconsistent electricity, unaffordable electricity. So we went up there, and it was fascinating in that there was the need to kind of blend OPIC financing with investment from private sector people, as well as some public sector dollars from USAID. And although conceptually that made sense to AID, it was very difficult for us to do it. So we soldiered ahead anyway, but the lack of coordination, collaboration was a real challenge. But I can assure you, OPIC's presence was the only reason why investors would have considered going in there. I just add one other example of one that started, I think, actually during Peter's time and then ripened through mine, which was creating an SME lending facility in Palestine. And when we started working on this, we were planning to do this in both the West Bank and Gaza. The folks in Gaza voted for Hamas. That was the end of our interest in lending to them. But in the West Bank, we got a very robust SME lending program going. And that was an incident in which you can't just decide there are small and medium-sized businesses that want credit, because we're kind of operating on Western-type ideas of what credit is all about. I mean, we wanted banks to offer these loans, and the only way they were going to offer them was for OPIC to share risk with them, which was critical. But they couldn't lend on the basis of traditional collateral because most of the borrowers didn't have any collateral. Certainly didn't have as much collateral as the banks wanted. So we had to train them in how do you evaluate credit risk for lending on the basis of reputation or cash flow. And so OPIC worked with AID to get a small grant to help train people to do that. If I were king and I was designing what the OPIC of the future would look like, I would have limited grant authority for us to do things like that training so we don't have to go beg our partners at USAID to give us the money. So we can operate in those environments, but we could operate much better. This was a $230 million lending program, which has been spectacularly successful, has enlisted, I don't know how many banks at this point, but 7 or 8.
I was just going to say, it's not only that the program that was created under your leadership, Rob, has been so successful that now the banks have come back saying they wanted to re-up, but this time they want a lower guarantee because they're willing to take more risk now. It's made over 800 loans at a default rate of less than 2%.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to come back. I'm going to ask both Elizabeth and Peter this question later, but I want to, Rob, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, but if you had a magic wand, if you could, let's suspend disbelief and let's assume that at some point there's going to become a moment where the administration and the Congress will conclude that because of what's going on in the world and what the opportunities are, and because of American jobs and American national security interests, that we actually need to totally rejigger our development finance capacities. What would, just in broad brushstrokes, what would be some additional things, you might just share with this group, what would be the things you'd want to see happen?
Yeah, I'd say this is a good time to be thinking about this because, again, as Elizabeth said, you have entities like DFID or the Brits who are doubling or tripling their commitment to development finance. Why? Because it's a very effective tool of fighting poverty in a sustainable way. So we ought to be doing more of this, not less. And if I had a magic wand, I would give OPIC more authorities or capacity to do certain things. So OPIC can't take equity positions in deals that it finances. I think it should have that authority. And I think everybody up here agrees that's something that could make a big difference. I think we ought to have, I already mentioned the capacity to make small grants. I would add to that first loss capacity. In other words, there's some deals, that Palestinian deal we talked about, there was also a affordable housing deal, which didn't work out very well, but it was well intended. But it was originally a $500 million affordable housing deal in which we had $20 million from DFID in the form of first loss capacity. If we could have had $50 million in first loss, we probably could have gone from $500 million to $1 billion. And first loss absorbs that first highest risk loss. So for OPIC to have that capacity could make a big difference. So I think these are all things and fundamentally the way you'd pay for it, let's just remind everybody, OPIC makes money every year.
How much did it make last year?
$350 million.
It's sent back to the U.S. Treasury.
That's right. And it costs $70 million. So that's a net of $280 million. We ought to think about setting up kind of a process in which OPIC can keep more of its revenue to grow and to provide the additional capacity or investment that we've described. So we have the means of doing that without actually tapping into the regular federal budget. We just need the will.
So I'm assuming if they actually zeroed out OPIC, they'd actually have to find the money to replace that. Isn't there been some kind of there's been some thinking about that on the Hill, like, if we get rid of it, that actually means we got to go make up the $250 million or so?
You have $22.5 billion of outstanding obligations. Those are projects that are already out there.
These are OPIC projects that are already going on.
Yeah, so you have to attend to that. And actually, you're protecting the American taxpayer, so you don't want to give that short shrift. So, yeah, I mean, I'm convinced that there's recognition, notwithstanding a suggestion from OMB that they eliminate OPIC, that cooler heads will understand not only do we have a robust portfolio of projects, we can build on that, we can build a stronger, more agile, more creative OPIC, and I think when we do, you'll find significant bipartisan support for it.
So could everyone kind of manage their electronic gadgets and stuff a little bit better, please? I know there have been like 4 or 5, fireworks going on, so everyone kind of take a little tech check here and cut it out. Thank you. So So I have one last question for you, Rob, which is about China. So tell me about in your time at OPIC, how did China come across your radar screen, and what is that, and how should we be thinking about that in relation to OPIC?
Chinese have been very smart strategically. They know how to engage, and even though when I first considered Chinese engagement in countries, I'd think huge bureaucracy, state-managed companies, they must be inefficient as heck. But in fact, they're pretty impressively quick. I mean, I've had people across the continent of Africa tell me, look, we'd much rather do business with American companies, but it takes you all so long to get these deals done. And once the Chinese sign a deal, they move full speed ahead. They often move full speed ahead with a lot of Chinese workers, which is for some problematic. But I'd say, without exception, the Chinese are taking advantage of every vacuum they find. Not just in Africa, they're looking at Latin America. They're not welcomed as enthusiastically in Latin America as they have been in Africa, but it's a lot of because we're not there. Now, they started out kind of awkwardly with insistence upon Chinese workers. They're now less insistent in many cases, but they're having an extraordinary impact on parts of the world that are strategically very important. I'd say one country we haven't, that we haven't focused on because it's not in Africa is Pakistan. One friend of mine in Pakistan whose judgment I trust said, as a result of all the infrastructure that China is committed to build and is building, power projects, roads, port facilities, there are over 1 million Chinese workers on the ground in Pakistan, and you can rest assured they're doing everything they can, not just to participate in executing the plan, but also to create markets for Chinese goods. And that's, again, where the U.S. And OPIC can play an enormously beneficial role, is to help create markets in which American companies can compete.
So I did an article in Forbes after visiting Pakistan 2 years ago, and my takeaway after spending a week in Pakistan is that U.S. policymakers look at Pakistan as a problem to be solved or a problem to be managed. The Chinese see Pakistan as an opportunity. There are 200 million people in Pakistan. It's going to go to 400 million people. I think it's going to be the 4th largest country in the world. It's the fastest urbanizing society in South Asia. 2% of its population every year is moving from the countryside to the city. We can either participate in the upside and help make Pakistan a happy story, or other folks are going to make it a happy story, or it's going to end up an unhappy story. So we can pick one of those options. I'd like door number 2. That's my option. It would be door number 2. So I agree with you, Rob. Okay, so I'm gonna come back to. I'm gonna go on to Peter, and then I've got a couple of questions for you guys. Then I'm going to open it up. So Peter, thanks for being here. Has this conversation changed at all since 2001?
Actually, sorry to say yes and no, but it is yes and no. It was actually clear to the incoming OMB management in 2000 that there had been, frankly, mission drift of OPEC, and it needed to be arrested. And so myself and others, when we came in, we had a very strong dictate that the focus or the abuses that we had seen, if you wish, Fortune 50 had been, OPEC was seen, rightly or wrongly, as the ATM for the Fortune 50. I was basically told, reform it or shut it down. And we're hearing a lot more along those lines. What hasn't got a lot of attention are the types of things that Rob, Elizabeth, and done to, in fact, substantially restructured the agency in a way to, in fact, eliminate, not just eliminate the dysfunctionalities, the mission drift, if you wish, but have punctuated the fact that you can achieve all of the national security objectives that all of our friends, including in the Freedom Caucus and others, want, plus capture all of the employment gains in the United States, all of the various benefits of exports. And so the reality is that none of these objectives are mutually exclusive. And the reforms that we put in place, including ensuring that the projects were scored against development impacts, really need to be better appreciated and frankly understood by our colleagues who haven't had the opportunity, frankly, to update themselves on the reforms. And I was helpful in just getting it started. Rob, Elizabeth put them in place. But if I could, I'd just like to punctuate a couple of metrics that really reflect why it is so critical that this organization remain part of the United States mechanism for supporting economic development around the world. It still stuns me to realize that only 4.4% of the world's population lives in the United States, and yet we are responsible for about 39.5% of the world's economic wealth. And so you have to ask yourself, therefore, okay, what is it about the United States economic model and system that is so successful that is not in place around the world that we can and should be encouraging, that do have job increase for the United States and exports? And the fact of the matter is, it's because there are a lot of countries out there who are illiberal, totalitarian, and who are totally opposed to the market reforms that risk-sharing by the United States helps alleviate and brings wealth and social welfare gains in these countries. And that is, in fact, the sort of the Trojan horse of OPIC, if you wish. So risk-sharing with those nationals in those countries who live in repressive countries are the driving force of economic reform that is consistent with the United States' interest and makes money for the United States. If I could just give a couple of reference points, please. One of the projects that I think we all continue to be proud of is, and this goes to the question also of this suggestion that OPEC money displaces private sector money somehow and distorts private sector investment. 2002, the South African housing minister came to us and said, listen, our revolving building facility for the monies that our contractors has dried up by reason of the fact that our equity ratios have out of whack. Would you be prepared to come in and provide a second loss position whereby we could reestablish and restart the building program? So we put this into effect at zero cost to the United States taxpayer. All we had to do was to, in fact, reserve against the monies that were put in place as a guarantee. And when we wrapped up the program, it was responsible for creating 2.3 million people housed. And these were owned houses. And then my smart colleagues, I'm not that smart, but my smart colleagues, you know, like Poland and Drumhill said, you know what would be really tremendous? Let's put in a secondary mortgage market so these people can be able to take equity and drive SMEs on this. So that's what we did. We put that in place, a secondary mortgage market. 60% of economic growth comes from small and medium-sized enterprises. Much comes from mortgages. Then somebody had the great idea, well, let's protect the ownership of these folks if they get HIV/AIDS. So we put an HIV/AIDS program in place. All at zero loss to the United States taxpayer, and in fact, we made $1.4 million on that project. So would somebody please tell me where that disruption is? Could somebody please tell me why it is that those types of projects are not something that even the most conservative members of the Freedom Caucus would not want to support? Let me have one of them stand up and say they wouldn't support that. I'd like to see it, because there's so much disinformation out there. I've got some metrics on the Chinese that will stun you, okay? Whoops, excuse me. Now, our friends in the China Development Bank have assets around about $1.5 trillion. That's a T, folks. And China's various regional and development funds have portfolios of about $100 billion overall. China's Development Bank annual financing in Africa went from essentially zero in 2010 to $4 billion in 2014. Latin America, $21 billion in 2015 alone. And I could go on and on. The fact of the matter is that the economic model of the United States can and is successful where we risk share with those people who want to embrace it. Now, here's the really interesting thing. 2/3 of all economic growth in the next 15 to 20 years is going to take in middle-class populations outside of the United States. Food security, improvement in the quality of education services, and the like. The United States is best positioned to provide those types of exports and those types of needs. And you will only do that when you can have local, customized platforms in those countries that can service U.S. exporters. You cannot service those types of enterprises by the United States. You have to be in country. That is America first. That is the mechanism this administration has to understand. So these things are not inconsistent. The Trump policies are not inconsistent with a robust role of the United States. They create a force against illiberalism and the forces of reactionism. They provide market solutions. And think about this. I'm sorry to keep repeating it, but we made $1.4 million off creating 2.5 million houses where we did not even have a loss. Now, if to disband OPIC is the answer, what the hell is the question?
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Peter. So Peter, very briefly, if you had a magic wand and assuming that you wanted to repurpose OPIC for today or to strengthen America's ability to take advantage of the phenomena that you're describing, what changes would you make to the way OPIC is currently set up, briefly?
I really do share the view that we need to have a better way of working with our FE friends on equity projects. Our system's just not well framed to do that. And we do have to understand we need greater flexibility in terms of the percentage of financing that goes with some of these domestic companies abroad. But anything that can support, for example, the benefits of the United States, such as we've got chain, this increased amount of chain manufacturing and the like, anything that supports the ability to have U.S. products in, notwithstanding the fact that the percentage of U.S. content is not as high, we will still get the value long term.
Thank you. So, Elizabeth, if you had a magic wand, what changes would you make to the current arrangement of how we think about development finance, if we think about the way OPIC is currently set up, and what additional capacities or what fixes would you make?
Right. Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thank you, Peter and Rob, for those interventions as well. Just stepping back from that, I think the whole DFI model is just coming into light. The DFIs have been quite isolated in each of their own countries, and no one's actually looked at it all together until you all did the work that you did. Think about the fact that the price tag to solving the problems that the world has agreed we need to solve, okay, Paris I know is still a question, but is $100 trillion. $100 trillion. The total aid budget of all the countries in the world together is about $137 billion. So there's a pretty big gap there, hundreds of billions of dollars of gaps. The DFIs, when you take them all together, are at about $95–100 billion in investment every year. So, and they're growing incredibly quickly. That's up from $10 billion only 10 years ago. So this model is one that is coming of age right now, not a minute too soon, because we need the private sector to be able to address all the problems that we've discussed. So the fixes that I would have, first of all, I would recognize that OPIC hasn't really had a fix in 50 years, in many respects. We've been fixing it within the statutes as they were originally drafted, but there's quite a few things that need to be changed. First and foremost, the agency needs to be able to grow to meet market demand through its own resources. That only makes sense. It can still generate a huge amount of profit for the taxpayer, but just using some of that to pay for its operations. Every $1 million of of budget into OPIC generates about $150 million of commitments. So that's a production function that could be dramatically levered up. Secondly, it does need equity authority for sure. We're the only development finance institution in the whole community of 30 or so of them that has neither a grant facility nor an equity capability at its disposal.
Could you just spend just a second on what do you mean by a grant and what do you mean by equity, just for that television audience out there?
So I would argue that USAID is a terrific organization that is expert at making grants, donations to create
making
things
donations.
where the private sector is not going to fund it.
Yep.
Equity is when you actually are buying a share in a company or in a collective investment.
So taking some small ownership in a
Yes.
company.
I believe OPIC should start with the ability to, as it's already doing, in fact, with debt, to provide equity to collective investment vehicles, investment funds, private equity funds, and then eventually moving on with once the expertise is great.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Elizabeth, but I'm in a total agreement. But if I'm setting up an Africa investment fund, and so what we want to do is get out of the foreign aid business in Africa, because what African countries want is more investment, and they say, okay, well, one way to do that, to prime the pump of that, is to create a private equity fund. Right now, OPIC doesn't have the ability to make those, it has the ability to provide lending capital that looks like equity, but it's not really equity. And so it would really help if we could have a little bit of money for, say, investing in a country like Ethiopia or investing in a country like Nigeria, right?
We already have, OPIC already has the expertise in dealing with these private equity funds because we have, as you said, anchored them, seeded them with long-term debt for, 60 of them by now. It's about a $5 billion portfolio successfully seeding and funding these private equity funds. But we can't invest at the same level as the other equity investors. We're always senior, and we don't have the upside either. So,
I think we're perceived as, not because we're not as smart as them, we're as smart as them, or smarter, but because of some of the plumbing issues and some of the permissions that we have from the Congress, we're not able to meet them, and so it's sometimes difficult to work with us. Is that a way to describe it?
you could say that, yes. We don't have the same tool as all the other development finance institutions, all the other countries. We have a different tool, and that makes it very awkward to be in the same vehicle. The third thing I would do is clearly look at all of the policies and adjust for the 21st century. Those policies can be extremely restrictive and really prevent the agency from being able to do all that it could do. Clearly, the agency needs a reauthorization, a permanent one, or at least a 10-year one. And then there's other things that would be very valuable. For example, if you're really going to put this agency in a position where it can do the most good and generate the most capital and help the most U.S. businesses, it needs to operate more like a bank. It needs to have full treasury operations. It needs to be able to issue bonds, corporate bonds in the market so that it can fund itself that way. So there's a number of other things that I would do. I would say the last thing is I think it clearly, as Rob mentioned, the agency clearly needs access, or either its own or access to somebody else's grant money or first loss money on a privileged basis, because too often we're coming up with a transaction. I'm thinking of in the post-earthquake Haiti, we were trying to do another more lending facility, Peter, like the one you mentioned in Haiti, but we needed to pay for the implementing agent on the ground in Haiti that would actually make the decisions about who's getting what guarantees from whom. And it was only through begging, borrowing, and stealing that we managed to get our colleagues at AID aligned with us and able to provide the grant money that was necessary to set up the operation in Haiti that was then going to take our guarantees through the local banks to support mortgage lending in that country. So I would say being able to use its own resources to fuel growth, equity authority, more policy flexibility, 5-year reauthorization, treasury operations would be my top 5 or 6.
Okay.
and
Yeah,
it
I wanted you to talk about, I want to come back to this issue of national security. Would you comment on that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Just before I wrap up on the other one, I think that the key really here is we have a great opportunity right now with some fresh thinking in the government to really rethink the entire U.S. development architecture and to ask ourselves, do we have the right resources, the right instruments, the right tools, and the right skills in the right places and in the right balance? Because it is my belief that if you allowed OPIC to really grow, to meet market demand, to do as much as it possibly could prudently, remember this agency has made money for 36 straight years, and its write-offs are less than 1% of its portfolio every year, which is an extraordinary record if you consider the fact that it's operating in some of the most difficult places in the world. If OPEC was able to grow to meet market demand, it could generate a lot more income that could then cross-subsidize the grant-making organizations like AID. So one could imagine sort of a closed-circuit ecosystem where the private sector is actually financing the really hard work in difficult places where the private sector can't go through this ecosystem where OPEC's generating cash and cross-subsidizing the other entities. So that's an ecosystem that's part of my kind of vision for the situation. But on the national security front, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dan. I mean, certainly Peter and Rob have done a lot on this score as well, whether it means OPEC helping rebuild and restructure in Iraq after the war, doing the same in Afghanistan, a myriad of projects that we could go into. In Ukraine just recently, OPEC's providing financing to allow the Ukrainians to have more autonomy in their sources of gas, so they're no longer dependent on the pricing and the seasonality and the unpredictability of their gas supplies from Russia, for example. But I think the microcosm that for me tells the story most clearly is in Jordan. So Jordan is one of the U.S.'s most stalwart allies. It is surrounded by extremism. The leadership in Jordan has been incredibly brave in speaking out against extremism despite the neighborhood that they live in. They've got over 1 million Syrian refugees in Jordan, in a tiny little country like Jordan. It's one of the most water insecure countries on the planet Earth, and they have none of their own sources of power until they started a renewable energy program a while back. So what's OPEC been doing in response to that? We've been trying really hard to do everything we can to support that critical bulwark state. First and foremost, there's a water project, I think it was under you, Rob, that's bringing water from an aquifer down by Saudi Arabia all the way up to Amman, providing about a quarter of the water in Amman and actually in the refugee camps north near the Syrian border. A power plant, a gas-fired power plant, we've financed is supplying 25% of the power to the whole country. And part of that for briefly, when the power supplies were shut off, the gas lines were shut off from Egypt, that gas-fired power plant was being fueled by diesel brought up in trucks from Eilat, hundreds of miles from the south. That's the only way they could get the power plant running, was on diesel being trucked in. And small and medium enterprises, another small and medium enterprise lending program that's providing hundreds and hundreds of loans, again, very strong performance, to small businesses who are employing many, many people in that country, including some of those Syrian refugees. And then most recently, just in the last couple of months, there's been very exciting gas finds in the Mediterranean Sea called Leviathan and Tamar fields. First time ever that Israel may actually become energy independent, and Israel's going to be supplying gas to neighboring countries. OPEC is providing the political risk insurance for the development of those fields that will then completely change the geopolitical situation in that part of the world.
So a vote against OPEC is a vote against Israel, what you're telling me. Just saying.
I have to give credit.
Let me just have
Sure.
Elizabeth finish.
So I just know,
was gonna give it.
I think that just sort of tells a story where you take a country that needs a lot. No banks are lending in that country. These investors were not thinking of investing in Jordan. Well, okay, maybe the gas finds, yes, but many of the other ones, no. And so, the agency was able to garner all of that support, find the right investors, bring them in, finance it, and make a lot of money doing it at the same time.
So Elizabeth, I need you to answer this. I want to come to Rob, and then I'm going to come to Peter. There are two other critiques that is OPEC effective and is it efficient?
I think.
I mean, this for someone who does this all the time, you'd say, of course it is. But if someone who doesn't know anything about OPEC says, is this effective? Is this efficient? What would you say to that?
So certainly an agency that's able to help U.S. businesses do development, and every dollar you put into it produces $5 back to the Treasury. I think that's probably the quickest way of saying that it's effective and efficient. But I think another measure, and this actually goes in part to the corporate welfare question too, one of my favorite indicators of OPEC's contribution, if you will, is the gap between the non-performing loans, the clients that struggle, miss a payment, they don't fall, they struggle. And our non-performing loans were anywhere between 5% and 7%, but the actual write-offs in the end of the day, less than 1%. it's the gap between the clients that struggle and the ones that fail that tells the story of what that agency is doing to help these investors succeed in these markets. And I think the other thing to say is accountable would be another adjective I would use along with efficient and effective. And certainly in terms of accountability, I think the transparency is extraordinary. We've all invested deeply in creating searchable databases of all the projects that you can find on the web and noodle around and determine what you want to find out. Public posting so that the agency is not only efficient, effective, accountable, it's also transparent.
Thank you. Okay, so Rob, I want to just go back to this issue of American jobs. I know that I think that if I'm the Trump administration or if I'm I'm one of the members of Congress, I want to understand what does this mean for the American people. So could you talk a little bit more about OPIC activities and how does that impact on American jobs?
Well, first it's worth remembering that every project OPIC does includes an analysis done by a very able bunch of folks in our Office of Investment Policy that evaluates impact on the U.S. economy, impact on the host country economy, and a variety of other things. And we're very attentive to the issue of job creation in the U.S. And Elizabeth cited examples, and there are others. You also mentioned the Jordanian power plant, which was burning gas from Egypt. The company, U.S. company that developed that gas and still is operating that gas is a company called Apache. And we could show you a map of from whom Apache buys its parts, its tubular goods, its gauges, a whole host of things that go into building and sustaining that project. And it's all over the United States. Now, personally, as a Houstonian, more of it's in Houston than anywhere else.
I noticed you're wearing your Texas tie today, and it looks great. Just want you to know.
I know, thanks. But that's just one example of the extraordinary impact of these projects across U.S. Manufacturing and U.S. companies, U.S. services.
So it's not just the company itself; it's the whole supply chain that's impacted.
Absolutely, and again, most of these companies will not do these deals without the risk mitigation of an OPIC. So that investment, I mean, Apache never would have done that deal without the support of an OPIC. And I can tell you, having insisted, like all three of us have, on being in addition to what the private sector can provide, I wanted to make sure that commercial banks weren't going to finance this, or commercial insurers weren't going to insure it. And the answer is they won't. So they don't mind being part of the financing, they don't mind being part of the underwriting, and they have to be. But they're not going to take the lead on this, and without an OPIC, it doesn't happen. So one other point on the jobs issue. I mean, even though there's plenty said about the impact of trade on the United States and on American workers, 4 out of 5 customers in the world are outside our borders. And we have to be mindful of the fact that our economic future is tied to our capacity to compete in these markets around the world. And U.S. investment brings this great bit of fresh air, transparency, and accountability to economies that are essentially closed or heavily state managed. So when someone says to me, OPIC is distorting markets or having a negative influence on markets around the world, my answer to that is, first of all, where are the free markets? I don't see many. Second, I didn't go to a single country OPIC was operating in which the economy wasn't heavily dominated by the host government, and private capital investment was the best thing to happen in that country in terms of pushing it in the right direction towards entrepreneurial capitalism rather than state-managed economy. So I just don't see it. I don't think it's reality. I think it's naive to suggest that, and I push back aggressively on it.
Thank you. Peter, I know you...
Just one number to add. I mentioned 400 jobs last year. It's 280,000 in total.
So 280,000 American jobs are impacted by OPIC activities.
That OPIC's created, yes.
Okay. Okay, Peter.
A quick thing just to punctuate the Israel energy project. Congratulations on having done that. There was a project that the President's going to Israel very shortly. He's going to be able to announce the development of, it was the Noble Energies project. That will actually bring about a situation whereby Israel is going to be substantially energy independent in due course, in no small part because of that project. And it's also going to have a knock-on effect to provide Jordan's energy needs. And guess what? Created $2 billion of procurement within the United States.
Well, and just to add, I mean, there's also Palestinian opportunity there. If there's to be a two-state solution, if there's to be a Palestine living safely and comfortably next to Israel, then it shouldn't be an economic basket case. That's why we did a lot of the business we did at the behest of our State Department and our White House. So, and if they have the potential to participate in the energy development,
Precisely.
their own gas, they're not dependent upon somebody else for that.
Great, okay.
And
You all
just
been-
quickly, just on, you mentioned jobs. Another recent OPEC terrific project is the Viewpoints project in Ecuador, airport, new trading partner in the United States. Substantial exports will run through that. And I really do want to focus on the point that Rob punctuated. 2/3 of all economic growth internationally is going to be happening outside of the United States in the next 15, 20 or more years. Substantial, significant element of that is customization, because local communities and cultures want to have their particular elements represented. Supply chains are critical to that. You cannot contest those markets without having local platforms or local joint venture partners. And that feeds into America First, because if you have that platform, then we have the export mechanism to be able to go into those markets.
All right, thank you very much. I want to call on some folks because I know you've all been very patient. So I'd like to hear from this young woman here. We're going to bunch them together. So name, and then this gentleman here, this gentleman here. So go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Ross. I'm a recent master's student at American University School of International Service. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about OPIC's impact on women. A lot of times in economic development, women get left behind due to social norms and an inability to have access to financial markets. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to that.
Let's bunch several questions together. This gentleman here.
Thank you. Welcome. It was a great speak out. I'm Jordan Sellers from Howard University. Can you help me with the taxpayer entrepreneurship to small business, and then what about, welfare to work and how that plays into maybe like Social Security and the foster care system? I know that's a lot about economics and working it, but I really would like help with that. I think it's a lot about the taxpayer
Great.
and welfare.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, this gentleman here, this gentleman here.
Ed Barber, Good Works International. Before we got into the current budgetary environment, there was a lot of talk about combining TDA, OPIC, and others into a sort of a super DFI. I would assume we're going to have that discussion again. Elizabeth alluded to it. Going beyond improving OPIC, is there some way we need to reorganize our approach to this area?
This gentleman here.
Larry Schaefer, Schaefer Global Management. Larry Schaefer, Schaefer Global Management. Talk about OPIC's interest in agriculture internationally, please.
Okay, and this gentleman here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm a recent graduate of Harvard Business School and Harvard Kennedy School. So just to play devil's advocate, how would you respond to the critique that in the places that we're countering extremism or terrorism, whatever you want to call it, or countering an insurgency, OPIC really doesn't have the capacity to provide a real strategic effect, number one. And then number two, how would you respond to the critique that in the countries that arguably need it the most, so again, countries in conflict, OPIC doesn't have sufficient capability to provide proper oversight to projects?
Okay, I think and this gentleman here with the great bow tie, I can't miss this. Yeah. The bow tie did it.
Cecil Hunt, I'm practice law here with the firm in Washington. But a little over 30 years ago, I worked on creating OPIC. And so my bias will show that briefly. Second point, I wish I could ask probing questions the way Dan does. So my question is, why is it that today we haven't heard more from the panel about the multilateral institutions, both multilateral development, DFIs and insurance institutions. In my experience, government and in private practice, some of the strongest leverage to getting developing countries to do the right thing in their own best interest has been the leverage that IMF, MIGA, others, development finance, multilateral institutions have brought. Isn't there a way to increase support for what the multilateral institutions do and then focus more sharply what's done nationally, bilaterally?
Okay. Why don't I take a stab at the multilateral one, and then I'm going to let everyone on this panel take the different questions that have been raised. Let's just make sure we cover most of them. So my view is that there's a need for lots of different players to provide development finance capacity, A. B, I do think there's an advantage to having some specific American development finance capacity that responds to the American national interest. So, for example, I think it's more difficult for the IFC or some multilateral institutions, although very important, I've been a big supporter of them, to work in some of the more difficult conflict-affected states. I think that if the CEO of OPIC has been asked by the President of the United States to say, I really need you to go to Afghanistan, it's a lot different than if someone's at the Treasury Department, a mid-level bureaucrat, says to the IFC President, I really need you to do a lot more in Afghanistan. They may send you a postcard. There's a little bit more ducking and dodging, if you ask me, having been over there. They're great institutions, and some of them, I mean, I think they're all really good. So that's not a knock on them. It's just that it's important to have a bilateral. I also think there's plenty of work to go around as well. There's not enough. These institutions on their own can't do. There's a huge financing gap that Elizabeth mentioned earlier. So that would be my take on that. And I also think it's lamentable that we're even having a conversation about zeroing it out, given that all the challenges, whether it's China, whether it's the business opportunities for the United States in infrastructure, or the opportunities, the emerging opportunities in middle-income countries, as well as the fact that we're going to need to bring private sector to tough, difficult places, these failed and fragile states. It's not going to be about foreign assistance. So I do think, so because of that, that's why most of this conversation has been about OPIC as a DFI for the United States and why it's in the national interest, why it creates American jobs, and why it helps American national security, which I think is a lens in which the Trump administration is looking at all of these interests. And that's a legitimate point of view, is to say, tell me what it means for us, why is it in the national interest? And so that'd be my point. So let me ask folks to cover the other questions or comments that have been made here. I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
Great. Well, I could touch on the women one, but I see Peter's pretty enthusiastic about it, so
I've got the numbers.
well, you got the numbers. That's good. I would just merely say that we were very excited that last year, the OPIC crossed the $1 billion mark in terms of its financing to support microfinance institutions throughout the world. The vast majority of them are serving mainly women. So that's all I would say on that front. On the IFC, if I could just pick up on that a little bit, in the last few years, we've increased dramatically our connection to the other DFIs, and including as well as the IFC, frankly, in an effort to kind of put a ribbon around the entire models and elevate it. But so many of the deals that we're doing, we're sharing resources with the other DFIs or with the IFC, sharing due diligence, sharing environmental assessments, sharing engineers, sharing consultants. So that creates much more efficiency. And with the IFC in particular, we've done maybe 30 of our deals in the last couple of years involve the IFC, because with IFC and OPIC have very complementary, common missions of harnessing the private sector for development, but very complementary tools and resources. For example, the IFC has an equity ability, which as we've said, OPIC doesn't have. They can do grants. OPIC can't do grants. OPIC's tied to U.S. investors. They're agnostic about the origin of the investment. OPIC can do much longer-term lending than IFC can. So that's the ways in which we're complementary. And just one other example of that, when the EBRD, are you still here, Michelle? No? When the EBRD started...
And I just want to say, I love the EBRD. So don't get me wrong, I love the multilaterals, and my favorite multilateral is EBRD.
So when the EBRD got permission from its board to enter into North Africa and other parts of the Middle East, it arrived in Jordan having no track record and no portfolio. But we, as I mentioned earlier, OPIC had kind of overperformed and were bumping up against our prudential limits in Jordan. So we were able to say to EBRD, why don't you join us and take a half of the next 7 deals in our pipeline so that we're only taking half the risk and you're creating an instant portfolio. And we've worked, and it worked extremely well. I don't think it was 7 deals we did, it was maybe 3, but that was a great way to get off the ground in a very collaborative, collegial way when we had financial constraints. On agriculture, I would just say, yes, OPIC has increased significantly its financing of agriculture, which is challenging. It's not always easy to do. And that's been ranging from large private equity funds in Africa to rice production in Tanzania, to American horticulturist who with his wife went to Rwanda with these special seeds and was able to double production of fruits and vegetables in Rwanda thanks to his better seedlings and better technology. And then another example is a company in Oregon started a company called Big Tree Farms in Indonesia, who's providing an alternative to palm oil plantations and using coconut to create sweeteners without cutting the tree down, because it's just the sap that they use. And this is providing not only a much greener approach, but it's also much more profitable for the farmers. All told, OPIC's portfolio in agriculture is providing support to 1 million smallholder farmers today.
And just to add to that, part of our evaluation on projects is, are we enabling agricultural producers who are going to basically try to export it to the United States and undermine U.S. farmers? So if there's a problem there, we don't do the project.
Right. Thank you for that. But on this last question, which is a very interesting one, is this part of a broader consolidation of agencies? When I talk about rethinking the U.S. development architecture, what does that really mean? And for me, there's basically 3 ways you can do that. You can do it the really hard way, which is try to merge entities together, which creates a huge amount of blood and gore and heat loss and all of that. Not to mention there's vested interests which are going to be unhappy about that. Secondly, you can actually take parts of departments or pieces of organizations' functions and merge them together. There's been some conversation about taking the Development Credit Authority at AID and attaching it onto OPIC or the enterprise funds. I mean, that could make sense. There's parts of OPIC right now that could move over to others as well. So I think moving functions or departments is a lot easier to do and could be done by an executive order or even less, actually. But for me, the most important of all is to improve the plumbing amongst the organizations so that, as I said earlier, so that when OPIC has a project that can't happen without just a little bit of technical assistance or first loss, as Rob was saying, we have some place we can go if it's a viable project to get that. So I think creating more incentives and a better working relationship between the agencies of the development architecture would be extremely powerful. And one way to accomplish that, I think, would be to have a cabinet level person on the development agenda to whom all the agency heads reported, which would be one way to do it.
So just like the intelligence community has the DNI for soft power, we ought to have a DNI for American soft power. Is that a way to describe it? Okay. Okay, Rob?
Yeah, let me, because Peter wants to speak to the first question about impact on women, let me try to address the question you asked about welfare and impact perhaps on populations in which we're investing, or at least I'm perhaps filling in a question that I wanted to answer as opposed to what you asked. But I would argue that notwithstanding all the challenges we find around the world, all the differences about religion and national origin, all these other things, we all share as human beings this aspiration to put food on the table, to put a roof over our heads. And where we suffer often in the United States is we can perhaps through conflict establish some relative stability, but then the question is what's next? And it's a lot easier to get a soldier to put down a rifle and pick up a shovel than it is just to put down a rifle. And we're about to see this in Colombia. In fact, we're seeing it already. Some will put them down, some won't. You have to incentivize them. But OPIC can be. Hasn't been historically that often because it hadn't been the principal priority of OPIC to be the first responder and to be in some of these challenging markets. So I would agree with you. I think we have a very light track record of being on the front lines in the last 40 or 50 years, but in the last 10 years we've gotten much better at it. So Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Palestine, We're in Egypt now, Tunisia. So
Ukraine.
there are lots of Ukraine. There are lots of examples, and we can be a first mover. And essentially, what we have that others, perhaps can't offer, is access to credit and access for small businesses. I'll just give you one last example of how quickly we can move when we want to. When the war broke out between Lebanon and Israel in 2007, and there was an awful lot of destruction in Lebanon, and we were competing against Hezbollah. They wanted to help pay for repairing houses that they had helped destroy, frankly, by their own missiles. We responded literally within 48 hours through a relationship we had with Citibank and local banks in Lebanon to provide a small home repair and small business lending facility. And that was quick. Now, we had to be quick because Hezbollah actually had people sitting at tables on street corners handing out cash that the Iranians had provided them. So, we can compete with that, but that hadn't been our principal calling or even our best suit. But I think it can be added and strengthened, and that's part of the kind of upgraded OPIC that I'd love to see.
Peter?
Well, the metric that I just have, and it really just punctuates Elizabeth's, runs to the significance of being able to provide financing for women entrepreneurs who play such a significant role, particularly in agrarian communities. And the latest figures I have is that OPIC, and these include current projects, have provided 8 million microfinance loans to women entrepreneurs to the present time. And the compounded economic social welfare gains that come from those projects are significantly higher than you'll find in most demographics. The closing point I would like to make goes to the difficulty, actually, of being able to share information with some of those folks who really haven't had an opportunity of understanding the history of OPIC or what it does. And I'll include some of our folks, our critics, who have posited that we disrupt the private market. But I would ask any one of them to see if they have a problem with this project. And this is the first project that I supported when I came into OPIC. So this is a faith-based organization out of Texas, not for profit, that wanted to drill water holes for agriculture and potable water, didn't have the capability other than a seed funding that we gave, no private sector money, and as a result of the project financing we provide to Living Water International, which was a modest $200,000 and then later $500,000 loan, Living Water today has over 14,000 water projects in over 21 countries. Agriculture, schools, hospitals, and it's a terrific model. Get this. If you're somebody who comes with a bucket, you get free water. If you're an institutional user, you pay for it. Same thing with agriculture. I don't know any single critic of OPIC who would be willing to stand up and say they would not be prepared to support that project or they would not be prepared to support the organization that established it.
Okay, great, Peter. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, I'm going to give you the last word. So if you were speaking in front of a congressional committee and they asked you why should we support OPIC, what would you say to them?
I would say I would say that there can be no better way to project American leadership, American values, and to help make the world a safer place and to support our national security and our businesses than this model. That is proven, that is tested, that is financially viable, that is providing revenues to the taxpayer year in and year out for 36 years.
Please join me in thanking the panel.